Okay, welcome back. Part two of our long Olympics lecture in two parts. So just to wrap up where we were last time, we were looking at the second of the charter values, which is peace and human dignity, which often comes up as being the primary goal of the Olympics, to foster peace and human dignity, peace between nations, unity through human dignity, which is inherent in that. So just to wrap up there, somebody I should introduce you to here is the IOC President Avery Brundage, who is president from 1952 to 1972, really sets the tone for the IOC at a very important juncture for a very long time. And there's a quote from him about this: "We actively combat the introduction of politics into the Olympic movement, are adamant against the use of the Olympic Games as a tool or a weapon by any organization." See, the problem with that this desire to be completely apolitical is what Brundage doesn't recognize is that the IOC was validating politics as usual. So this apolitical stance is really a bias towards validating politics as usual in any nation state that gets to host the Olympics, regardless of their politics. And so in the weird world that was the Olympics and Brundage's world and the IOC, somehow a Nazi salute is acceptable, but a Black Power salute is not. And his legacy really continues Brundage's. In fact, the IOC in 2020, just in 2020, prohibited any political gestures like kneeling. And that's a direct quote, like kneeling, which so it's still in that terrain where we're trying to maintain this illusion that you can be apolitical in and being offended even. Brundage was even offended when, with the Black Power salute, he said that these guys shouldn't have been there in the first place and they did damage to America's reputation. So the job of the IOC has been very much to not only to validate these regimes for giving them the games, but then to also get on board with supporting them. And as I talked about with the Beijing Olympics and repression of dissidents and getting on board with China's repression of anti-Tibetan dissidents. Okay, so in any case, that is so much for the charter value of fostering peace and human dignity. That's often not turned out quite that way. Okay, moving on to amateurism. The Olympics were initially amateur and very strictly so. This changes in the 1980s, and if you watch Miracle on Ice, you see the U.S. taking gold in hockey in 1980. These guys are still amateur, but that's towards the end of it. And why this change? Why this changed towards professionalism, which it's definitely gone in that direction? Well, before we go there, let's take a look at just how strict that amateur code was. And there you have it from Coubertin, and you should know by now from what I've been saying that this really was the vision of the Olympics, was a completely amateur, fostering amateur games and muscular Christianity and all the rest of that. And you can see that in Coubertin's initial call, which was to the amateur athletic associations in the various countries which created the Olympics, which are the original participants and which screen the athletes that go there. And you know that as well from chapter 5 of our text. And you know how powerful that was, that the Canadians could with the Tom Longboat controversy, right? So you understand that this is completely about amateurism, the Olympics was. And we see the extent of that in this guy, Jim Thorpe. Jim Thorpe, potentially the greatest U.S. athlete of all time, really, and two-time All-American. He's a college and pro baseball, basketball, and football player, all three of these. So he also, before that, got medals in the Olympics in the decathlon and pentathlon. He's a fascinating guy. He's a Sac and Fox First Nation from Oklahoma, and who went off to Carlisle Industrial School, the famous first boarding school in America for First Nations, and goes on after the Olympics to a career in pro baseball and football. And then he gets stripped by the IOC, though, of his medals because he played 2 seasons of semi-pro baseball before going to the Olympics. So he wins these Olympics in decathlon and pentathlon in 1912. And afterwards, the IOC strips him of those because he played 2 seasons semi-pro baseball before going to the Olympics. And there's a quote from him. I hope I will be partly excused by the fact that I was simply an Indian schoolboy and did not know about such things. In fact, I did not know what I was doing was wrong, because what I was doing I knew several other college men had done, except they did not use their own names. So there was his defense of it, defense of his semi-pro status when being stripped of his medals and protesting against that, which got him nowhere. In any case, and there was also a bit of racism involved there too, because he is indigenous, and he also was of the opinion this would not have happened to a white athlete. But it's definitely important, and we see that with Coubertin, or the amateur ethic is strictly adhered to for decades. We see that with Coubertin's attitude towards our Hamiltonian runner, right? William Sherrill, and Schering, calling or writing to the Governor General of Canada in protest of him getting money after the games. We see that with Avery Brundage being very upset when athletes went on to, professional skaters would go on to make money in other fields and in film, like Barbara Ann Scott, Canadian Barbara Ann Scott, or whoever. That offended him, that they would even go on from the Olympics to use those medals to capitalize on that, to make good on financially, which is completely not his idea. Meantime, Avery Brundage is fighting this growing, what's an unrealistic stance to take during the Cold War, and that kind of hints at where I'll be going. And in fact, he's the one who's to blame for, well, I guess you could say the Canadians are to blame themselves, but we pull out of international ice hockey competition because of Avery Brundage protesting against the IIHF, saying that the Canadians could field professional hockey players in international play, not NHL, but professional hockey players. So he protested against that, even though it's not his territory. International Ice Hockey Federation is not under his aegis. He protested that, saying it would lead to the end of amateur hockey at the Olympic level. So the IIHF reversed its decision on that, and in response to that, the Canadians pulled out. And that's a bit complicated. It comes up in the episodes and whatnot, but in any case, the important point is the amateur ethic is strictly adhered to. But we get a sea change after Brundage is gone. Okay, 2 years after Avery Brundage is gone, the IOC changes its charter. Okay? So we get a massive sea change quite soon after replacement of the president, the long-time serving president. And amateurism is, or professional players are now allowed in the Olympics quite suddenly. So why this change? And it's a couple of things, but largely it's about the pressure of the cost of hosting. So that original decision to have a rotating venue means a super expensive Olympics, and that can only be offset by taxes or by a television audience. Of course, at the same time we have the growing reality of first radio and then television, which is changing everything. Okay, so the cost of the games is really what is leading the IOC to change towards accepting professionalism. Slavery Avery, as he was known, by the way, and read about him. Yeah, there's lots written about Avery Brundage, super controversial guy, infamous for his alleged racism and sexism. He went on a fact-finding tour to Germany in 1936 to get behind these for the IOC, to get behind the concerns that were being expressed about anti-Semitism in Germany and the lack of Jewish athletes that were being fielded from Germany. And he said everything there was just fine, and you know how he reacts to the Black Power salute, that it's shaming America. In any case, and also he's infamous for his sexism as well, which we'll get back to. But yeah, in terms of costs, cost is the real reason for the shift to accepting professionalism, and the IOC shift to accept professionalism, and that really is drilled home in 1976. Okay, 1976 Olympics. Munich Olympics, as I said, had been a disaster because the Arab-Israeli uh, the Israeli athletes and the sense was that the Olympics might end right here unless the next Olympics are successful. This was the sense at the time. So Montreal was super important, and what could be a safer bet than Canada? So Montreal is thinking, okay, Munich was fairly expensive. It might have been 1 billion, but we're not sure. Montreal thought it could do it for 200 million, and it had done very well with the Expo 67. That had been a lean and very successful event, so Montreal is quite confident that could host the world here and do it for 200 million. Well, what it ends up costing is well, it's not twice that amount, not 4 times that amount, 13 times that amount. It ends up the Olympic cost Montreal $2.6 billion, and which proves Drapeau wrong in the brilliance of this cartoon. Which, because he did say that the Olympics, no more run a deficit than a man can have a baby. Longtime Montreal Mayor Drapeau had to eat his words and eat his hat literally because he said he would and he did. In any case, it leaves a really bad taste. Montreal confident going in and they completely blow the budget. In fact, they don't pay off their games until 2006. So Montreal's a financial disaster for a variety of reasons, some of which have stayed with us and have changed the landscape of hosting the games, which are always super expensive. But one thing is that inflation was starting to run rampant at the time. Unions have gotten stronger, so a lot of union troubles. And in fact, there's out and out bribery. The unions stopped working on the stadium till the province would kick in more money, this type of thing. Then the stadium was never finished on time, and it had design problems from the very beginning. The stadium is supposed to have a retractable roof. This does not finally get on until 10 years after the Olympics, and when it did, it never really worked. It leaked, and plus multiple ton concrete slabs of the buildings of the roof have fallen down a couple of times, which made the Montreal Expos, when they existed, they were afraid to play here. So, and I think right now they're on their fourth roof, and they're still talking about demolition being potentially cheaper than perpetual changes to the roof. Any case, after all this, this is only one. This becomes the symbol of the Montreal Olympics and the overspending. Commission looked into this. The Maloof Commission, an inquiry was done. It took 3 years to come out with their findings, and they themselves cost a fair bit of money. And where they go with it, they put it straightly on Mayor Drapeau. He gets the bulk of the blame for being arrogant and thinking that he could manage it. In fact, he didn't even have a project manager. Drapeau never hired a project manager. He took it on himself. The design of the stadium was way too complex. Security costs were way too high. With the stadium, Drapeau hired a French architect that he liked, Roger Taillibert, and he gave him free reign, which is never something you do. You don't give any architect free reign with anything. And in any case, so just a disaster financially. But we did quite well hosting the world, and the legacy of the games themselves were good. The bigger deal is trying to shed the legacy of Munich, and Canadians were proud to be hosting. And the games went off very well. Queen came out to open the games. Of course, her sister competed in them actually, which is kind of weird, kind of cool, in equestrian. Some very big moments here where. Coolest moment of all would be when gymnast Nadia Comaneci, Romania, she's all of 14 years old. She's tiny thing, and she gets a perfect score in for her routine. So globally, the Montreal Olympics seem to be a success. For Canadians, we're proud to host them. The best we get is Greg Joy's silver, as I said, and we get 0 gold medals, which has never been done before or since by a host city, or for a host country. So there's something, but the same time that it went off well in the eyes of the world, this is the lens from the IOC. boardroom. And here we have the president, Lord Callanan, who's been in for only a couple of years, and who made that switch in 1974 to allow for professionalism. And he's saying, I don't know whether Montreal or Moscow was more damaged in the Olympic concept, which is quite something to say, given what a disaster 1980 was with the United States after the Afghan invasion and the Western Allies boycotting. And then saying that his wife believes the coronary he suffered in '77 was due to the increasing burden of problems during the Montreal Olympics. And what he's talking about here is the cost, right? The cost overruns and what a disaster that was becoming. And when the games cost so much to host, that's the thing, host cities, countries need a way to pay for that. And without that, nobody would host, which means that actually there was nobody vying for the 1984 Olympics. There's only one city that would vie for the 1984 Olympics, which never happens, and that was LA. This is how bad it tastes that Montreal left in terms of costs. So debt is, Montreal's debt is a legacy, an important legacy. LA is the only city that vies to host in '84, and they're only doing it because the IOC has eliminated the amateur rule, and that's the thing. There's a solution. When games cost so much to host, sponsorship means more, and sponsors want a big audience. And pro athletes deliver that. So it's as simple as that, that here's the solution. And the solution is already coming organically by way of television. The solution is already coming, and it's a godsend to the IOC, and it's by way of television. And it's been the huge game changer that allowed the Olympics really to continue with these massive costs. Now, television has an interesting story of its own already. In the 1936 Olympics, this might surprise you that the Germans had closed circuit television. We already had CCTV back then in the 1930s. And televisions, we associate them with the 1950s, but they really are 1930s technology that become mainstreamed in the 1950s. So 1936, where the Olympics is already being filmed. But it's 1964 in Tokyo that we first get it live by satellite around, or at least to North America, 1964. 1968, Mexico City, global live coverage in color and by ABC. ABC in 1968 pays $7 million for rights to the game. So this is where. This is the winds of change. This is the solution that is seen to these problems that cities and nations are going to have with these spiraling costs, which coincide with and the growth of that. The potential here coincides with the Montreal Olympics. 1972, new IOC president who's open to commercialism, and so the stage is set. In 1984, we get our first what are known as the free enterprise games, full commercial sponsorship for the first time, and NBC or ABC in LA paid $225 million. ABC paid $225 million for the LA games, and the important thing is that the city was not, and the state was not on the hook for anything. Full commercial sponsorship. And of course, the audience wants to see. Or by the way, Calgary. That only starts things going, right. Calgary '88. ABC again pays hundreds of millions. This time, $400 million for the Winter Olympics only. So from '84 paying $225 million for the Summer Games. 4 years later, ABC paying $400 million just for the Winter Games. There was a bidding war that year, and Calgary made out very, very well. Calgary also did. Had hosted the games without any debt, and with some great new facilities like Kananaskis. Chump change now. NBC paid over $4 billion for the rights to all games from 2014 to 2022. So NBC paid for a block set of games, $4 billion for them, which for the IOC, this is just fantastic, right? It's a nonprofit that is now awash in money, and so these issues are of cost overruns are really largely a thing of the past, unless a nation wants to spend insanely on them, which is what the Russians definitely did at their Winter Olympics, and that's completely on them. But in any case, the 1984 were the free enterprise games, and that's really the first time that commercial broadcasting covered the entire cost. Reagan opened them, say no more, and here you have also the first professional athletes starting to appear. Michael Jordan is here in his first pro year on the NBA, and what's officially actually the last amateur U.S. basketball team. So it's still an amateur basketball team in '84. So there is a lag between the 1974 rule and what happens on the ground. Following Olympics in 1992, and ever since, we've had the American Dream Team, right? The first Dream Team is 1992, and they're winning by an average of 44 points against their competitors. So it does take something away from the game. That's for certain. At least in basketball. Carl Lewis is in LA winning gold 4 times. His manager is charging huge fees for his appearances now, and Nike's also been sponsoring him for years by now, so he's in their commercials and all that kind of thing. Now the funny thing is that his perceived ego problem at the games, when the world's attention is on him and the way he acts, has Nike dropping him after the games. So the games weren't necessarily a blessing for Carl Lewis. Coca-Cola also drops him afterwards. And there's debate about how egotistic he was, or that's just the way he came across. Also, second powerful rationale for going pro is the Cold War and the Soviets. So that's the other one. One is cost overruns. The other is the fact that the East Bloc, they don't respect amateurism. As Canadians know all too well, there is no such thing as an amateur athlete behind the Iron Curtain. So this again is a powerful rationale for going pro. The Soviets, the East Bloc will field anyone. The Red Army team in the Winter Games takes every gold from 1956 right up until 1992 with the dissolution of the Soviet Union. They take it that year as a unified team. It's not until '98 that we get the Czech Republic winning, and now we have an even playing field. We have an even playing field because NHL players are allowed to play as well, and professionals from the West are playing as well by now. So this really is a big part of this push for the rationale for allowing professional athletes, because effectively they're happening anyway. The Soviets also really didn't share in any of the or many of the ethics, the amateur ethics, the amateur code, because winning is everything for the Soviets, and ethics go out the window. And you see that in the fact that the East Bloc is where doping is really perfected, where kids as young as 8 are identified as star athletes and then owned by the state and pumped with steroids. And no change in that. We know that even after the collapse of the Soviet Union, by 2016, we still see the Russian track and field team scandal with state-run doping still a thing there. If you've seen the movie Icarus, which is an amazing, fascinating film, you see the doctor who's the head of the Russian anti-doping center, the testing center, who's running the doping for cyclists. So going pro is seen as a way to level the playing field, which makes sense, because behind the East Bloc, behind what was used to be called the Iron Curtain, any athlete is simply called a soldier or a student. They're never professional. So level the playing field. And it does. It absolutely does. But of course, it's hypocrisy to say that we don't know the same thing on this side. And there's the interesting thing about the professional game of professionalism coming into the Olympics is how and commercialism and the weight of sponsorship and the value of sponsorship and what that means to the game. It makes things much more competitive, and it also means that doping becomes systemic in many sports in the Olympics. In 2003, the U.S. Olympic Committee's ex-director fed Sports Illustrated the results of tests that from 1989 to 2000, and which showed that over 100 American athletes had failed tests and they still competed. So that really is indicative of the fact that what we found out with Ben Johnson and a few others was systemic. Okay, unfortunately, well-rounded athlete. What about that? So let's look at our next Olympic value. And here's, I have to say that the charter begins with this preamble, the first point, which I kind of dismissed when we began the lecture, saying it is, and it is, it's amorphous, it's amorphous, it's somewhat gratuitous, and it sets things up for it kind of in vague language about what the other points are about. But what it does say is something interesting. It talks about a balanced whole, combining in a balanced whole the qualities of body, will, and mind, blending sport with culture and education. So it's not completely meaningless. It talks about really here the well-rounded athlete, which is what Coubertin was all about. And it's really, it sounds like muscular Christianity, body and mind, sport and education, right? The 19th century amateurism from which the Olympics came. The language is right there. It's embedded in that. And education and sport, one is supposed to elevate the other, okay? And does it happen that way? Does the Olympics foster a well-rounded athlete? Well, for that, let's look at what has been written on this by Lincoln Allison. So I'll introduce you to him. He's a well-known sport historian. He's written quite a few books on the history of sport, and he's written on the Olympics themselves. And he says what the Olympics do actually is quite the opposite. That we do have Olympians who are well-rounded this way, 100%, but we also have a whole lot of the opposite. And what he means by that is it won't sound surprising to you. You have the super young athletes that are robbed of childhood. You have the total specialist who's not even allowed to develop other interests or other sports. And then you have these retired athletes who can't find their purpose in life because they've only ever been given that one. So Allison calls this the gladiatorial approach, where the athlete is this slave-like machine who's kept from everything else. Definitely, it's like the Soviet system come to the West, and it's definitely not the ideal of the well-rounded athlete. Segue to Michael Phelps. Case in point, starts swimming at the age of 7 and eventually wins more. He has won more Olympic medals than anyone ever has in the history of the Olympic Games. He starts his serious training very early enough that he's in his first Olympics when he's only 15. But for the next 16 years, all he gets to see is the bottom of a pool from 2000 to 2016. And after the 2012 games, and maybe you know this, he falls into a deep depression. Maybe you recall that he got a DUI and all these other things that hit the press, obviously. And he says it was all because he had his whole identity wrapped up in this one thing only. And that's all he was. Which is definitely not a well-rounded athlete at all. It's the opposite of that. But by that point, he's worth $55 million in endorsements and appearances and all the rest of it. So, well-rounded athlete, not so much. Yes, in certain sports, and definitely maybe for the majority of athletes it is that, but for the high-profile ones, certainly not. Okay, the inspiration effect. What about that? This is the fourth of the 7 points in the Olympic Charter, and it's axiomatic among the IOC. They say it all the time. And the Olympic Creed says this, that it inspires broad sporting participation. Coubertin says this, and it's continually said. And how it's expressed in the Olympic Charter is in number 4, that the practice of sport is a human right. Every individual must have the possibility of practicing sport without discrimination of any kind and in the Olympic spirit. What it's getting at there, this is the phrasing for the Olympic vision, which is to inspire sport in any nation in which the Olympic Games are held, among initially amateur athletes, of course. And again, it's taken as axiomatic in the IOC that is what it does, and that's a lot of what their propaganda gets at. But is that true? Well, yes, there are upticks in some games during Olympic years. This is what we get from surveys and what we get from studies, but just as there will be surges in things like tennis after Wimbledon, but they're always short. their studies also show this that they don't tend to last. There's another thing that's interesting about commercial sport in general is that studies also show this tendency for a drop in participation in sports with superstar athletes that are widely watched, and that's all pro sports. And a good example of that is the NFL. There's been steadily declining numbers of people playing football in the United States in tandem with its growth in the television audience, which is very peculiar. The same token, you get twice as many kids playing soccer in Canada as hockey. And how often have you watched televised soccer? Not nearly as much. Anyway, but that gets into other things. Maybe it's just too gladiatorial, right? People worried about Junior getting his bell rung in hockey. So it's a bigger thing, obviously. So nobody really knows why this happens, causation or correlation. But yeah, it's unclear what impact the Olympics has in terms of inspiring sport participation. And I'll leave that for Lincoln Allison to make that clear here in his great quote about it. Even if there's anecdotal evidence for the inspiration effect, there's also for both the indifference effect and what might be called the couch potato effect. Great quote on that. What we do know, and this is kind of connected, is that there's also no direct line connecting a sporting culture with success in the Olympics. So you can have a non-sporting nation, which like China. China is really a non-sporting nation, but they can get a lot of medals because they will resource it. Or you can have a very robust sports culture like Argentina and get no medals. In fact, those two nations were first and 34th at the Beijing Olympics. If it wasn't about money, those numbers should be reversed. Argentina should be number 1 and China number 34, but it is about money. A good example of that too, Argentina got less medals than Uzbekistan in Rio. Borat land, right? Uzbekistan and China came in third, which is a total disconnect between Olympics and broad participation in sports. So there's a disconnect between Olympics and broad participation in sports. In other words, the benefits of play may just go to the athletes alone, which then makes it an elitist thing, which is not the vision at all. On the other hand, and here's where we'll close. On the other hand, there's other things that we should be happy that don't fit the original ideal, and one of those is gender equality. So here, Coubertin's vision of all male games is compromised right away, as I said in the second Olympics in Paris, where we have 19 female athletes, which he's not in favor of. But we'd say is all for the good of the sport. Women were competing in small numbers during his lifetime, and after he dies, more and more of them. There's a disincentive initially in the early games, partly because of the cost, because women were seen to require a chaperone, so it was twice the travel cost. But yeah, it changes throughout the 20th century, and eventually the IOC mandates that any sport must have a female equivalent. So any Olympic sport must have a female equivalent, and almost all of them do. Almost all of them do. There's 2 games that are still men only, and that's wrestling and Nordic combined. There's 2 that are female only, though, to make up for that, and that's synchronized swimming and rhythmic gymnastics. I did see a movie about a British synchronized male swimming team, but it was a comedy. Anyways, but yeah, the IOC mandates any sport now must have a female equivalent, and 40% of athletes overall are now female. That doesn't mean that it's all gender equality and roses and all that at the IOC level. At the political level, only about 20% of the IOC board members are female, and that's a lot less for the various international federations, the different countries in it. The committees of the participant nations, that's about 14% right now. The other thing is that women are still kept out of Olympic sport in 39 different countries today, and that is countries with different cultural views about women's equality, and yet they're in the Olympics, and their women are kept out. There's also gender testing, by the way, and that's this whole fraught thing, which Another point here. Avery Brundage was no again real hero. He was fairly misogynist as well, and so his legacy lasted. It was a chill effect on equality for sure for a good 20 years. And here's a great quote from him for 1957. Great. Many still believe that events for women should be eliminated from the games, but this group is now a minority. There is still, however, a well-grounded protest against events which are not truly feminine, like shot putting or those too strenuous for most of the opposite sex, such as distance runs. So he wasn't pushing the doors open, that's for sure. Okay, last point is there you see the frontier in is gender testing, and that, or the frontier today actually is transgender females who are cleared by the IOC. The frontier in terms of equality, cleared by the IOC to play at their testosterone levels test below 10 parts of whatever testosterone per liter. In any case, this is where it's at today, and gender has always been a fraught thing in the Olympics, and that goes back to claims that the Soviets were fielding male athletes as females. The Press sisters were thought to be male, and Mary Weston was a transgender individual who later became a male, but had won a lot of medals as a female. So this is a really interesting and difficult terrain, and I encourage you to go here if you want to do an essay on the history of this. Okay, so there you go. That's me sidestepping that one and encouraging you to pick it up if you feel so inclined. Thanks for listening. There's our second, and I'll have one more short lecture about Canadian involvement and a bit more on Canadian involvement and talking about the Winter Olympics. So I hope you enjoyed it. Any questions, let me know.